This is Charlie Rose.
We came to Cambridge to meet Stephen Hawking, where he has lived and worked for 40 years. He is considered by many to be one of our greatest living scientists and certainly our best known. For the past 30 years, in fact, he has held the post once occupied by Isaac Newton as Cambridge's Lucasian Professor of Mathematics. For his entire career, he has dedicated himself to the study of the basic laws which govern the universe. With Roger Penrose, he showed that Einstein's general theory of relativity implied space and time would have a beginning in the Big Bang and an end in black holes. These results indicated it was necessary to unify general relativity with quantum theory. The search to discover this so-called theory of everything has been the driving quest for physicists for the last quarter century. Hawking says that this unified theory could, quote, help answer some of the ultimate questions about the universe and our existence. He was born on January 8, 1942, 300 years after the death of Galileo. He grew up in St. Albans, a town about 20 miles outside of London. He attended his father's alma mater, University College, Oxford, where he was awarded a first-class honors degree in natural science. He then left to do research in cosmology at Cambridge. It was during his early days at the school that he was first diagnosed with the progressive neurological disease, amyotrophic lateral sclerosis, or Lou Gehrig's disease. While he was given a prognosis of just a few years to live, he has defied that expectation by decades. 6 years ago, 60 Minutes visited him at Cambridge on the occasion of his 60th birthday, a milestone few predicted he would have achieved.
Hawking's 60th birthday party was held at Cambridge University, where he was surrounded by his family, his students, and cosmologists from all over the world who had flown in to honor one of the most famous living scientists.
What was going through your mind at those celebrations?
For many people, 60 is an unwelcome milestone, but for me, it is quite an achievement. I never thought I would get so far.
Hawking can communicate only through a voice synthesizer attached to a computer. By clicking a switch with the little movement he has left in his fingers, he chooses words and builds up sentences on the computer screen. It is a time-consuming process, so we gave him most of our questions in advance so that he could program his answers in the computer. Although, as Joan Goodwin, one of a team of nurses who accompanies him everywhere, explained, some set phrases are pre-programmed.
And things like good night and goodbye. And
Hello.
Hello.
How are you?
I'm fine.
Despite all of Stephen Hawking's remarkable accomplishments in the field of theoretical physics, it was his 1988 book, A Brief History of Time, that made him a household name. Though very few can claim to have actually completed reading the book, it sold 10 million copies, becoming one of the most successful science books ever written. Along the way, it established him as an iconic figure, known as much for the way he has managed his disease as for his scientific accomplishments. Recently, he has written yet another book along with his daughter Lucy. It is called George's Secret Key to the Universe. It attempts to explain the cosmological world to a younger audience. We spoke last week in Cambridge, but before I introduce you to that conversation, we have a conversation about Stephen Hawking and his work with Sir Martin Rees, Nathan Myhrvold, Lisa Randall, and Brian Greene. Sir Martin, thank you very much for allowing us to come to Cambridge and to visit with you as we visit with Stephen Hawking.
Well, it's great to welcome you here.
When did you meet Stephen Hawking?
I met him when I started as a graduate student in Cambridge, and he'd been here already in that role for 2 years, and I've known him there for more than 40 years. And at that time, it was not expected he would finish his PhD because his disease had started and the prognosis was bad. And as an astronomer, I'm used to very large numbers, but fewer as large as the odds I would then have given against now, 40 years later, him being not only still alive, but the most acclaimed and admired physicist in the world in many people's minds. So it's an astonishing story of a great crescendo of achievement that we never expected.
How did he do this in terms of living this long with a disease, ALS, a Lou Gehrig disease, that kills many people within 10 years of its inception.
Well, I don't know the medical prognosis, but clearly it's an unusual one compared to what happens to most people with that disease. But undoubtedly, he's been kept going by his immense determination and the fact that he enjoys so much what he is doing, and he gets reinforced by the support he gets from everyone around him.
Is his reputation more because of his celebrity and the fact that he, as he says, I'm the most famous disabled genius in the world?
Well, I think if you look at his work and forget about who he is, he would certainly rank as one of the people who've done most to extend our knowledge of gravity beyond what we had in the time of Einstein. So he's one of the great figures in our understanding of gravity. The fact that he is the world's most famous physicist is, of course, not only because of his physics, but because of the way he has striven against the odds and the way he has engaged with the public and the way he has been an inspiration to people far beyond science for the way he surmounted his handicaps.
One of the top 20 physicists in the world?
I would say he's one of the top 20 theoretical physicists in the world, but of course you probably haven't heard of the other 19, and the fact you've heard of Stephen, but have heard, and he is so famous, is of course because he combines that with all the other attributes and the fact that he has done this against tremendous odds.
When you look at his work, beyond, as you said, gravity and the black hole and investigations into that, what will he be best known for?
I think he will be known in the history of physics for some important work he did mainly in the late 1960s and the 1970s in understanding the nature of black holes, the nature of the Big Bang, and in some really pioneering ideas on how we could relate to previously unrelated branches of science, namely quantum theory and gravity. He had a very important idea about black holes and how it relates to quantum theory, which has been the subject of much discussion over the 30 years since that time.
In fact, he has written about and talked about the pursuit of the theory of everything, which is combining with quantum mechanics and at the same time gravity and the theory of relativity.
Yes, well, that is, of course, still an elusive goal, and many other people, especially those who do so-called superstring theory, are working on that, and we don't know if that'll pan out or not, but certainly we all know that it's important to unify these two basic ideas in physics. The 20th century gave us Einstein's theory of gravity, it gave us the quantum world, but there's no way of unifying the very large and the very small, and that's one of the challenges, the unfinished pieces of business for the 21st century.
If we reach that, what have we done? What have we accomplished?
Well, that's an important question, because we will have reached the end of a chain of progress that goes back to Newton, who told us that the force that holds us down on the Earth is the same that holds the Moon in its orbit and that makes the apple fall, and which went on through other great scientists who unified the different forces. So it will be the end of a very important progress in science. But I think the phrase theory of everything is slightly hubristic and misleading, because it won't really help most of the rest of science. If you're a biologist or indeed a chemist, you're not held up in any way by the fact that we don't have this so-called theory of everything. What is the challenge to most of science is that things are very complicated.
But do you believe there is a single theory of the universe that will show us how everything fits together and how it all, why the universe and why it works and why? Well,
I think there may be a theory which is a linkage between the very small and the very large, which gives us a deeper understanding into the forces of nature, the size of the universe, and the kind of particles and atoms that exist in the universe. I think there will be that. But once we have that theory, that's not the end of science. It's the end of one phase. But we still have the challenge of another frontier of science, the very complex. We'd have linked together the very large and the very small, but the very complex, especially the living world, faces us with deeper challenges. And I think that is going to be what keeps us busy for generations to come, and indeed raises many problems which may have to await the post-human era, because we have to ask whether all these problems are accessible to our human brains or not.
I want to get to the planet and its survival in a second, but let me just say, there is also this idea of what some people call brain theory, which has to do with sort of membranes and
B-R-A-N-E.
That's it, B-R-A-N-E,
Yes.
and it's connected to even string theory. Can you explain that in layman's language as to why we ought to know more about it?
Well, I myself am not an expert, so I can't explain it in detail, but the basic idea, which goes back to Einstein, is that it's geometry and space and time which underlies everything, and that most of what we see in the universe, including the particles, can be explained as space and time being wrapped up in very complicated ways. And one interesting complication, which is a feature of all these ideas, is extra dimensions beyond the ones we're used to. We're used to the 3 dimensions of space, left and right, up and down, forwards and backwards.
Now there are
and
4.
then time. And time
is 4.
Yes.
Yeah.
That's
And some people even say they're 6 and 7 dimensions.
Well, indeed, and there may well be. And many people suspect that there are extra dimensions which we don't see because they're wrapped up on tiny scales. Many people believe that space itself has a grainy structure, just like any substance like this chair has. But whereas the grainy structure of material objects is on a scale of atoms, the grainy structure of space is on a scale a trillion times smaller than atoms. That's why it's so hard to get any relevant experiments. But the suspicion is that on that tiny scale, space has a complicated structure where there may be extra dimensions which we don't see because they're rolled up very tightly. And the analogy people give here is if you have a hose pipe, which is really 3-dimensional, it looks like a line from a large distance, and likewise there may be these extra dimensions. But there's an even more exciting idea which relates to brains, which is that perhaps some of these dimensions aren't completely rolled up. There is even the idea that there may be other universes, as it were, apart from ours. And there may, for instance, be another universe which is only a millimetre away from ours, but we can't detect it because that millimetre is measured in some extra spatial dimension, and we're imprisoned in R3, just like if you imagine a whole lot of bugs crawling around on a big sheet of paper, which they think of as their 2-dimensional universe. There might be another set of bugs on a parallel sheet of paper thinking that they were in a separate universe, and if they had no concept of the 3rd dimension, they couldn't be aware of the other one.
Is that the brain theory in part?
That's one variant of the brain theory, but it is the idea that there may be extra dimensions, and to understand gravity, in particular to understand why gravity is so much weaker than the other forces of nature, we need to take account of these extra dimensions which are different from R3. As it were, the forces can leak into extra dimensions and get weaker.
As you know, when Einstein was alive and beyond creating the, coming to the theories that he did in, I think, 1915, 16, 17, somewhere right around there, and then he achieved great significance later in the 40s and 50s. Some people look at today in science and they say all the action is not in physics, but it's in molecular biology. What do you say?
Well, it's certainly true that the study of the very complex has been greatly boosted by what's happened in molecular biology, and that's one of the great frontiers of science now. But I would say that the study of fundamental science, in the sense of the subatomic world and the cosmic world, is also going through an exciting phase. There's been a bit of a lull in understanding the subatomic world, but that I hope will end in a few months' time when the LHC, the so-called Large Hadron Collider in Geneva, which is going to be the world's biggest particle accelerator, comes online. There's been a lull for about 20 years in exciting experiments in subatomic physics, and that will change, so I hope for a boost there. But the other thing is that we have realized that we can learn a great deal about the micro world as well as about the cosmos by using astronomy, because in the universe out there are lots of places where the conditions are far more extreme than we could achieve in the lab, even with the biggest accelerator.
Is there controversy about the Big Bang Theory?
Well, there's a consensus about what happened after the first microsecond. And it's great progress that after the first microsecond we have a fairly good idea of what happened and how it cooled down.
And what was the Big Bang Theory?
Well, the Big Bang Theory essentially is that everything started off very, very hot and dense, and then expanded and cooled, and at some stage atoms formed, and then stars and galaxies formed, etc. And then after about 13 or 14 billion years, we have the universe we see around us and of which we are a part, where on at least one planet around at least one star, a complex biosphere has evolved. So we've got this amazing emergent process starting from this hot, dense beginning and leading up to the universe we are part of. But the very beginning is still shrouded in mystery. As we extrapolate back closer and closer to time equals zero, as it were, then everything gets hotter and hotter, denser and denser. And when we get back into the first tiny fraction of a second, the first microsecond, the problem is that the conditions become more extreme than anything we can simulate here on Earth in our labs. And so things become more uncertain. So from a microsecond onwards, I would say that what a cosmologist tells you about the universe should be taken as seriously as what a geophysicist tells you about the universe.
And there'd be a consensus about that?
I think there would be a consensus.
After the first?
Not universal, but a very broad consensus about after the first microsecond was up. But when we go back earlier still, then the basic physics is still very uncertain, and that makes things more conjectural, more speculative, but on the other hand more exciting, because the only way we may understand and test our alternative theories for the extreme conditions that prevail then is by very careful and subtle observations of the universe.
If you collected 10 of the wisest people you know in your field, is there one big question that they most would want to answer, and would there be a consensus on that question?
I think there would be consensus that mysteries lie in the very early stages of our universe, and we won't be able to answer those until we have this unified theory, unifying quantum theory and gravity. They would agree on that. I don't think there'd be quite a consensus, but I'll tell you what would be my main question, which I think many string theorists would agree, and that is the question of how large is physical reality. What I mean by this is there's this huge volume we can see with our telescopes extending about 10 billion years, the aftermath of our Big Bang. But is that all there is? There could be a lot more beyond our horizon that our telescopes can't detect because the light hasn't time to get to us. There might even be other space-times separated from us in an extra dimension, or many, many other Big Bangs. And so many people believe that there's a lot more to physical reality than the cosmic patch, as it were, the volume of space and time, which we can observe with our telescopes. And this leads to a separate question. We know that the laws of physics are the same everywhere we can see with our telescopes. If I look at a distant galaxy and look at its lights and take a spectrum of that light, the atoms there are the same as the atoms in the lab. But it could be that there are other domains, other Big Bangs, that lead to cosmoses governed by quite different laws of nature, where gravity is much stronger, where there are different numbers of dimensions, etc. So physical reality may be much richer than a part of space and time we can see. And the key question is whether we will ever have a theory of a kind where we can write it on our T-shirt, which will tell us formally for the strength of gravity, the mass of the electron, and things like that.
Yes. What you said was there's a question as to whether we will ever have that.
Will we ever have that, yes. And the reason we may never have it is it could be that there is a theory, but it applies to a deeper level. And what we think of as fundamental are really environmental accidents, local bylaws in our cosmic patch. Let me give you an analogy. Think about snowflakes. Snowflakes all have hexagonal symmetry, and we understand why that's the case. It's a fundamental feature of the water molecule. But every snowflake is different, and it's different because the way it grows depends in detail on the actual humidity and temperature in the rain cloud where it forms. So for a snowflake, there's a basic symmetry that they all have, and then there are environmental features. Now, what we don't yet know is whether what we call the laws of nature are all bedrock features, or whether some of them may be environmental accidents rather like the details of a snowflake. And the environmental accidents will be properties of our own Big Bang. So we would be in a region 10 billion years across, which cooled down in a particular way and ends up governed by particular laws. But that may still be just a tiny patch compared to the entire cosmos. So the answer to that question, whether the laws of nature are unique, is very important, because it may require us to take our cosmic modesty one stage further. We've gone from a stage where the cosmos was our solar system plus the vault of heaven, to when it was our galaxy, and to when it was our universe of zillions of galaxies. But it could be that our Big Bang is just one of many Big Bangs, and we have a still grander scale to go to. So that's really the next step, and I would say that's the most fundamental question, to ask whether that's crazy speculation or whether that has a scientific basis.
It is Brian Greene who comes closest to explaining string theory. He is one of the bright lights of American physics, a popular professor of physics and mathematics at Columbia. He's one of the top 3 string theorists of his generation. What is it you're after?
Well, the basic goal of the current generation of physicists that are following along the path initially set down by Einstein is basically to find the master equation, that single overarching principle which can describe the universe on its largest of scales and on its tiniest of scales, and that way really give us a theory of everything in the universe.
Is there one one equation that will explain everything?
Well, we think that the answer to that is likely to be yes, and this new theory, string theory, may well provide us with that single all-encompassing equation. It's very much a work in progress, but the last 15 years of research give us very strong hope that it truly will realize its promise of the unified theory that Einstein sought but didn't find.
All right. If we find it, and if the string theory explains it all and is the connection that now enables us to get our hands around this single theory, what does it do for us, other than simply solving an intellectual puzzle?
It does a lot for us. For instance, one of the most pressing questions in theoretical physics is to understand the Big Bang, cosmology, how the universe began and got to be the way that we view it in the heavens. And without a theory of everything, that is, a theory that can talk about the universe when it's in incredibly extreme conditions, when it's very hot, very dense, very massive, we won't be able to ever truly understand why there was a Big Bang and how the universe evolved from then until now. So that's one of the key things that the theory of everything will give us. Other things, it will give us understanding of black holes and other exotic phenomena in the universe. And in this way, it will truly give us a shining light to illuminate nature and give us a true understanding of why it is that the world is the way we perceive it.
And then we'll be able to answer questions like, for example, what's the rest of the universe we don't know anything about?
Sure, absolutely. There are a lot of speculations on multiple universes that are existing in parallel with the one that we currently inhabit, and a theory such as this can give us insight into whether these are musings of science fiction or truly part of science as we know it.
Since Albert Einstein was involved in this, considered at the time, and I guess since one of the smartest human beings to inhabit the planet, is this the holy grail for physicists like you and so many others to find this equation?
Absolutely. This is the deepest problem in modern theoretical physics, and students, graduate students, postdoc faculty around the country and around the world are all vigorously pursuing, trying to find this rich nugget of information, this rich theory, this rich equation which will describe the universe.
How far off are we?
That's a tough question. We've made a tremendous amount of progress in the last 15 years, more than anybody in their wildest dreams would have imagined possible. But there's a way to go. And what we now know is that superstring theory, we believe, is paving the way. It's really showing us the direction towards that final explanation of everything. But it could be 5, it could be 10, it could be 100 years before we know whether this theory truly is the theory of everything.
Have we in the past thought we had it, thought we were close, and it turned out to be much more complex than we imagined?
Yeah, absolutely. In the turn of the previous century, there were some physicists who thought that physics was basically over and a few details were all that remained. And that was before relativity, that was before quantum mechanics, that was before any of the real deep puzzles and structures in the universe were really laid bare. So it's right, it's possible that we are fooling ourselves, but this is the first theory in the history of physics which doesn't need anything else for it to make sense. This is a theory that could describe everything, and that's something that all previous attempts at having a final theory could not claim.
Einstein died without finding it, obviously. Did he consider the last 30 years of life to be his single obsessive goal?
Yeah, his single goal was to find this final theory. And at that time, he was basically the only one pursuing it. So much so that he wrote in a letter to a friend something like, "I've become a lonely old chap who's displayed as a curiosity now and then because I don't wear socks." So he really was ostracized in a way from the mainstream community for this pursuit. But now we see that he was merely ahead of his time, as always, and his dream is the dream of most theoretical physicists today.
Stephen Hawking, is he a theoretical physicist?
Absolutely, yeah.
And is he working on the same issue?
He's working, yeah, he's working on related issues. He, for a while, was very much against string theory, but after 94, 95, breakthroughs in the field convinced even Stephen Hawking that this really is likely the way to go. And he now does attend the annual Strings Conference and does give talks in the conference. So it has his blessing now, and I believe this is at least part of what his research is about.
What I'm trying to set up is this notion of why this is important, first of all, see?
Right.
Before I have you try to, no, have you explain it to me and me try to understand it. So have a go at explaining to me what string theory is.
Sure. The basic idea is pretty simple. If you take any object, for instance, the tabletop, and magnify it and examine it on very small scales, there'll be molecules and atoms. And if you look at the atoms and magnify them, you'll see that there's a nucleus, protons and neutrons surrounded by orbiting electrons. And in 1968, we learned that if you magnify a proton, there's yet further substructure. The Russian dolls continue. Inside there are 3 quarks, even smaller particles. Now, for a long time, people thought quarks and electrons were all there was, together with a few other exotic particles that make up the universe. String theory comes along and says, actually, there's one more level of substructure. If you examine an electron or examine a quark at incredibly fine resolution, you'll find that there's a single loop of vibrating energy that we call a string. And that's the idea of string theory, that all of the particles in the universe are different ways in which a fundamental loop of energy can vibrate. So much like a violin string can play a C, it can play an A sharp, different notes that our ear senses, different tones, the different ways that these fundamental strings vibrate correspond to the different particles of nature. An electron is like a C, a quark is like an A sharp, and so forth.
Dr. Lisa Randall, she is a professor of theoretical physics at Harvard. She has done groundbreaking work into the existence of multiple extra dimensions. More about that later. Her theory, which she developed with her colleague Raman Sundram, has been called the best scientific idea of the last decade. She is now the most cited scientist in all of physics. It is a pleasure to have her at this table for the first time.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
I don't know much about physics. I just know that I'm interested in science, and you belong here at the table because you're doing stuff that, if in fact it's right, as some of your colleagues have said, will change everything. Okay, this multiple dimensions idea. Now, we know that, I think even Einstein said this, there were 4 dimensions, correct?
He included time as a dimension. That was actually a radical new way of thinking about things at the time.
So it's, what are the 4 dimensions?
The 3 spatial dimensions that we know about: left, right, forward, backward, up, down, and time.
And then string theorists came along and said there are 10 dimensions.
Yeah, string theorists seem to think that there are at least 10 dimensions.
And how many do you think there are?
I like to leave it an open question. I like to say, what have we measured? What do we know? And could there be other dimensions out there? And there certainly could be other dimensions out there. It might be 10 or 11 space-time dimensions, as string theorists tell us now. But it's really, ultimately, I hope there's going to be some experimental input to this and some theoretical input to let us know, is it really true that what we see is all that's there? Or is it a case where we're just not physiologically designed to experience or see those dimensions, but we'll eventually find evidence of them?
What's likely to be another dimension?
What do you mean by that?
Well, I mean, there are 4 dimensions.
Yes.
What would be a 5th, or what would be a 6th, or what would be...
The other dimension...
I'm trying to figure out what a dimension is. I can understand space and I can understand time.
Right.
But I can't understand what might be next.
That's right. And one of the things that makes it really hard to think about extra dimensions is that we can't picture them. I mean, in my book I say, you know, a word is worth 1,000 pictures when it comes to extra dimensions, because we can't picture them. But one really clever idea was, Edwin A. Abbott wrote a book called Flatland.
Right.
And he said, you know, to think about, we can't picture, we think we live in 3 dimensions. Maybe there's a 4th or even more spatial dimensions out there. He said, you know, that would be the same situation as if you lived in a 2-dimensional universe, or creatures lived in a 2-dimensional universe and couldn't perceive a 3rd dimension. What would the 3rd dimension be for them? I mean, they would be as puzzled asking that question as we are asking, what is this 5th dimension of space-time? So suppose you had creatures living in two dimensions. What would a third dimension look like for them? Well, they're not going out there, but maybe they'd see an object come through. So maybe they'd see a three-dimensional object like a sphere pass through their universe.
Yeah.
And if they did that, they would never see the sphere in its entirety, but they would see evidence of the sphere. They'd see a series of disks that grew in size and then decreased in size and then disappeared as the sphere passed through. In the same way, we could imagine a hypersphere, a four-dimensional sphere, could pass through our universe, looking like a series of spheres that grow in size and then decrease in size. I mean, the fact is that we can't picture these dimensions, but they could be there, and energy could be transferred to those dimensions. Particles could travel in those dimensions. Gravity could spread throughout that dimension. The fact that you can't picture it doesn't mean that you can't imagine it, or that. And there are ways to picture cross sections or projections or slices. But really, to picture it in its entirety is challenging for everyone. But it doesn't mean that we can't mathematically derive the consequences of what would happen if these dimensions were there.
Jerome Friedman, your former colleague at MIT, I think said that if we see evidence of what has been proposed by you, it will be extraordinary. It will shake up everything. It's pretty good.
That would be pretty good. I mean, it's true. I mean, if we know that we live in a universe with more dimensions, I mean, of course, you can't ignore that. You can't ignore that for any of the types of science we do. It would tell string theorists this is the kind of thing they should be trying to find in their theory. It would be telling cosmologists that you have to take extra dimensions into account when the universe evolves.
Are we months, years away from understanding the next dimensions?
That's a really great question. It turns out that there will be an accelerator. So an accelerator, particle accelerator, accelerates protons to enormously high energy. And there's going to be a new one that turns on. It turns on in 2007, but really will begin operation in 2008. It's called the Large Hadron Collider, the LHC. It's going to be at an accelerator facility called CERN near Geneva. And that will answer this question about the weakness of gravity.
Dr. Nathan Myhrvold is here. He is the CEO and Managing Director of Intellectual Ventures. It is a private firm dedicated to invention that he co-founded with former Microsoft chief architect Edward Young.
But you know what we really need here is a new fundamental idea. And science...
We need a new fundamental idea about
the structure of space, time, gravity.
And meaning that what, they need one fundamental idea that would explain everything, or what? What does it mean by we need a new fundamental idea?
At various points, physics has gotten itself stuck, or we didn't know what to do. So in the late 19th century, they thought they were almost done. There's some famous papers written saying, you know, we're going to measure a few more physical constants, we'll understand the universe, we can go home. A couple embarrassing problems cropped up, and by the 1930s, quantum mechanics had started. And there's only a couple of key ideas behind quantum mechanics, and those ideas opened a floodgate of additional things. Well, at various other stages, we've gotten stuck, and a new idea has extended it. So something called relativistic quantum mechanics. And Einstein's theory of general and special relativity, particularly general relativity, which is Einstein's theory of gravity. An amazing idea that is just breathtaking to anyone who really studies it, because where did he come from? Where did he get this idea? And he sort of explained where he got it. And so you look at the explanation and think, well, damn. I couldn't have gotten from what he says was the jumping off point to there. But once you have that idea, it opens up new vistas.
We met with Stephen Hawking and his daughter Lucy in his office at Cambridge University on Monday, February 25th. And here is that conversation. Stephen, thank you very much for allowing us to come here and visit you in Cambridge. My first question is that in some ways you have said that your illness has been a blessing because it allows you to focus more resolutely on what you can do with your life. What did you mean?
I don't have much positive to say about motor neuron disease, but it taught me not to pity myself, because others were worse off, and to get on with what I still could do. I am happier now than before I developed the condition.
You have also said that while you physically fit the part of a disabled genius, you personally don't believe that you're a genius in the same way that Einstein was. You know, how are you different?
I didn't feel I should claim equality with Einstein, but in fact all physicists think in rather similar ways. Einstein wasn't that good at maths, but had great physical insight, and had the courage to think outside the conventional approach. I just hope I have a little of those qualities.
You have thought deeply and written about the theory of everything. You once suggested that you hoped it could be found by the year 2020 or by the end of this century. Do you think that's a realistic goal?
In 1980, I said that a theory of everything might be found by the end of the century. That is still my estimate, but there's rather more of this century left.
Yes. And others have said this to me, including Bill Gates, that they might be more interested in going into molecular biology.
When I started research, I didn't want to work on biology because it seemed hand-waving and descriptive, and not to deal with the fundamental mechanisms. That didn't come until people began to work on molecular biology. But I'm glad I decided on cosmology. It is the most fundamental science of all, since it provides the setting and the laws for all the other sciences.
You've also been weightless. You have expressed a desire to travel in outer space. You know, what would that experience mean for you when you think about how much of your own work has to do with space and black holes and how we perceive the universe? What would going to outer space be as an experience?
I want to go into space because I want to encourage manned, or should I say, personed, space flight, because I believe that the long-term future of the human race must be in space. It will be difficult enough to avoid disaster on planet Earth in the next 100 years, let alone the next 1,000 or million. The human race shouldn't have all its eggs in one basket, or on one planet. Let's hope we can avoid dropping the basket until we have spread the load.
What is it about Einstein and you and Marilyn Monroe?
I think she preferred my dad.
I have a photograph of her and me.
Yes.
Too bad it's a fake.
We'll show it now. Stephen, when I look around this office where you work, there is Star Trek. That's been a part of your life. The Simpsons has been a part of your life. Selling 10 million copies of your book has been a part of your life. Despite all the struggle, it's been a great life.
I can't complain. I am satisfied with what I have managed to do, despite the odds.
You've also spoken about the role of art in our life, and one of your great loves in music was Wagner. You know, why does Wagner make you feel a certain way?
I was drawn to Werner, or Wagner, as my speech synthesizer pronounces him, when I was first diagnosed with ALS and given about 2 years to live. His music expressed my mood at the time. Werner manages to convey emotion with music better than anyone, before or since.
Whenever we think about certain questions in science, we also think about religion and whether there is a life after death, and most scientists I know don't believe in a particular God. What is your view?
Physicists believe that the universe is governed by scientific laws. These laws must hold without exceptions, or they wouldn't be laws. That doesn't leave much room for miracles, or God. I regard the afterlife to be a fairy story for people that are afraid of the dark.
This is a book that you and Lucy, your daughter, have written called George's Secret Key to the Universe, and it explains exploration into science from the, and we'll have Lucy talk about this in a moment. Before I ask the next question, Lucy, tell me how this book came up.
Well, I had the idea for George's Secret Key to the Universe for various different reasons. I have a 10-year-old son, and I very much wanted to work with my dad to write something that would explain some of the work my dad's done for my son and for my nephew and for all the other kids who were coming up to my dad and asking him questions. I mean, my dad would come to my son's birthday party and appear kind of like the magician, and all the kids would crowd around him and start saying things like, "So, Stephen, what would happen if I fell into a black hole?" Or, "Stephen, what would happen if I went for a walk on Jupiter?" And my dad was giving the kids these really, really good answers. They were very clear, they were very funny and very informative, and the kids were absolutely hooked. But I also noticed that all the adults were gathering round as well and listening to the answers and then going, "Oh yes, I knew that," when clearly they hadn't really got a clue. So I thought people really are interested. There are a lot of people who would respond very well to reading about some of these topics in an adventure story.
And who are the characters in the adventure story?
The characters are, there's a small boy called George who's our hero, and George lives with his eco-warrior parents, so he's had this very techno-free childhood, but he's got this great curiosity and this great imagination, which, having grown up with physics and having grown up with a lot of scientists around me, I see that as the hallmarks of a scientist, is this great imagination and curiosity and this desire for knowledge and the desire to ask questions and keep asking questions and to not be satisfied with answers. And George is like that. And George is sort of a bit like my older brother as well, who is, I'm not a scientist, my older brother is. And there's a bit in the book where little George goes to a conference of scientists and he puts up his hand and he asks a question. Because I remember being told about my older brother accompanying my dad to a proper conference of professional theoretical physicists, sitting in the front row, nodding the whole way through, and then asking a question at the end when he was about 8 years old. So that's George, our hero. And George meets his next-door neighbours, who are Eric, who is the world's greatest living scientist, and his daughter Annie. And Eric and Annie have this amazing computer called Cosmos, who's so clever and so powerful, he can draw a doorway through which you can walk to any part of the known universe that you want to visit. And so George's Secret Key to the Universe is really the story of George's adventures, both on the planet Earth and when he walks through the doorway.
And all of George's curiosity.
And all of George's curiosity, yes.
Here is the book, right here. You have said, and I believe this fervently, that you understand a child's curiosity because you, and we're both 66, you are a child.
We all start off as children, full of curiosity and wonder. I still have that curiosity and wonder. That is what Lucy and I have tried to convey in our book, George's Secret Key to the Universe.
What's interesting about this is, for me, is that journalists have the same kind of curiosity. I mean, all scientists I know, think of research as going on a journey, and there is a great curiosity about where that journey might take them, and so therefore, their own curiosity. And when you ask questions about what's the universe and what makes it work and why is it the way it is, and look for some theory of everything, you are simply expressing, the curiosity to how do things come together. You once said that a complete understanding of the universe, why it is as it is and why it exists at all, is your goal. How close are you?
During my lifetime, we have come a long way towards understanding the universe. We now know what will happen in all but the most extreme conditions. But we can't yet claim to have a complete understanding. So the quest that has intrigued and inspired generations continues.
The question of why the universe is. Talking about understanding the universe, you have said that there could be shadow galaxies, shadow stars, and even shadow people. How could this be possible?
In some models of the universe, we live on a brane, a surface in a higher dimensional space. there can be another brain a short distance away. This is called a shadow brain because we can't see it, but we would feel the gravity of matter on the shadow brain. As I said, there could be galaxies, stars, and people on the shadow brain, and all we would know about them would be their gravitational effect on our universe.
We are now talking about an area in which you made tremendous contribution to our understanding of the universe. You said recently that black holes aren't the eternal prisons they were once thought to be. How would you describe today the present notion of a black hole?
It was once thought that when something fell into a black hole, that was it. Nothing could get out of a black hole, not even light. That is why they were called black holes. But then I discovered that the uncertainty principle of quantum theory would allow particles to leak slowly out of a black hole. So things can get out of a black hole. They are not eternal prisons.
Or for human beings as well.
Maybe.
Depends on the human being.
You wouldn't look good when you came out.
Going to either lofty or not so lofty ideas, you once said that the work of physics, after the discovery of this grand unification theory, sort of the theory of everything, would be like mountaineering, climbing a mountain, or climbing Everest, mountaineering after Everest. What did you mean?
I would have thought it was fairly obvious what I meant. If we ever do find a complete theory of the universe, it would be a great triumph of human reason, but it wouldn't leave much for us to do. We need an intellectual challenge.
This is a yes or no. It would be the greatest achievement of science since Einstein's theory of relativity.
Yes.
Thinking about this universe that you think about, what worries you the most about the future of the universe?
I'm not worried about the future of the universe. The universe will continue whatever happens. But the future of the human race and of life on Earth is much less certain. We are in danger of destroying ourselves by our greed and stupidity.
You have said that humanity's ultimate survival then depends on colonizing the solar system.
It has taken about 4 billion years for life on Earth to develop to the present stage. During that period, the main threat has been from collisions with comets every few million years. But now the man-made dangers to our survival are much greater and ever increasing. If we remain confined to planet Earth, sooner or later we will destroy ourselves. The only long-term survival plan that works is to spread out into space. The sooner we start, the better.
Do we need to do it, yes or no, by the end of this century?
It would be a good idea.
What are we not doing to prevent these disasters that we absolutely should be doing?
Not acting don't sufficient urgency about climate change.
You think we will survive?
Maybe.
I hope so. You once said, and just tell me whether you said this or not, that there's nothing like the eureka moment of discovering something, and that it's different than sex because it lasts longer. Did you say that?
Yes.
And you meant it.
I know.
I'm going to go to Lucy for a moment. How has he changed for you?
Well, in the past few years, our relationship has changed because we've been working together. And that's been a lot of fun. And that's allowed me to see a different side of my dad because I've been working with him. Even at the level that I was able to access it in physics. And that was a great privilege for me because I was able to see what my dad's like at work in working on this book, on George's Secret Key to the Universe. And I really enjoyed that because I got to see how clear-minded he is, what a huge encyclopedic amount of information and knowledge he has inside his mind, and how quick he is in his thought process and how he can put different things together and they fit. So that was very interesting. So that changed our relationship, although I expect he was always like that. I suspect he's always been like that throughout his career. I think he's probably mellowed as he's got.
And probably had to climb out of some black holes, too.
He's climbed out of some black holes. He's travelled around the universe. He's been on a zero-gravity flight. But the one thing that hasn't changed about him is he has not slowed down at all. He still has a schedule that was really quite daunting. He's just been to Chile and to Easter Island, and now he's back, and then he's off to the USA. And so he's still got all his projects on the go, and obviously he's off into space next, on a real spaceship, not, unfortunately, we don't have Cosmos the computer. We can't just draw a doorway and walk through it to any part of the known universe that we'd like to visit. That would be very handy if we did. It would be very handy for research purposes. We'd be very popular. We'd have a long queue of people wanting to go through our doorway.
I've been told, Stephen, that the weightlessness experience for you was extraordinary. One of the great experiences of your life.
Yes.
Do you live with the idea that you may, as Charles Simonyi has done and others, go into space?
I hope so.
One last question. Is there word, determination, passion, will, that has enabled you to survive and to be the force you are around the world, and to have people see in you a representation of the great quest to understand who we are and how we fit?
I have just always done what seemed the obvious thing to do.
That says it all. Lucy, thank you.
Thank you, Charlie.
The book, George's Secret Key to the Universe, Lucy and Stephen Hawking. Stephen Hawking, at 66, a remarkable man. We thank you for joining us for this visit to see him and hear about him, and we hope to see you next time.